Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Barrowman. I'm a senior economist at the International Center for Research on Women, and I'm also the chair of the IAFI Online Events Committee. So I want to give you a warm welcome on behalf of the Online Events Committee. Today's event is the first of our Feminist Macroeconomics online event series, which I am extremely excited to kick off. This event track was inspired by the interest of members on the online events survey, as well as really a recognition that there is a need for feminist economists to engage more with macroeconomics outside of academia and to really promote knowledge sharing as well. So I'm so pleased again to kick this off with such an esteemed group of speakers and moderators today with an event focused on austerity, which is really a critical issue of our time. On the Online Events Committee, we have a number of events and other tracks, numerous tracks right now, I think up to 9. So please look out for more information regarding those. And you can also catch up on past events that you may have missed on IAFI's YouTube page, as well as on the website. And so as with those past events, today's event is going to be recorded and posted to YouTube just for your awareness. But this event is structured as a Zoom meeting and not a webinar. So a friendly reminder to all of you to please keep yourselves muted. You will have a time later to interact, to raise your hand and come off chat for a Q&A session. So at that time, you will be invited to ask questions. But throughout the event, please also feel free to put questions, comments, and resources in the chat. We're going to be sharing some resources with you as the event goes on. In addition, to make the most of our time with our speakers, we're just going to read out titles today, and we're going to be posting bios in the chat for your reference as well. So it is my great honor to turn it over to Diane Elson to moderate our event today. Diane is an emeritus professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Essex. So Diane, over to you.
I'm so glad to be moderating the first of an IAFI online event series on feminist macroeconomics. If you look back at the 29 volumes of our journal, Feminist Economics, you'll find many more contributions to feminist microeconomics than to macroeconomics. And I think it is vital that IAFI does more to nurture feminist macroeconomics, because macroeconomic processes and policies play a huge role in shaping what happens in markets, what happens in firms, in households, and whether gender inequality is reduced or increased. I can see there's a problem with my video. I'm going to switch it off and try it, switching it back on. Fingers crossed. So I was saying, these macroeconomic processes and policies play a huge role in shaping whether gender inequality is reduced or increases. And as this series will demonstrate, macroeconomic processes and policies are not gender neutral. They're profoundly gendered in ways that disadvantage the majority of women, but especially low-income Black and minority ethnic women, women living with disabilities, lesbian and transgender women, and women living in low-income countries. It's hard to see for many people that macroeconomic processes and policies are gendered, because people tend to think of gender as only a characteristic of individual identity. But I'd argue that institutions and systems are gendered too, often through what they render invisible, what they take for granted. Much macroeconomic analysis is gendered through the variables and data it does not include, the questions it does not ask. One of the first books on feminist macroeconomics, published in 1994, to which several IAFI members, including me, contributed, was called The Strategic Silence. And it highlighted the implications of the failure of orthodox macroeconomics to recognize the unpaid economy in which the majority of hours worked are contributed by women and girls caring for their families and communities. We argue this strategic silence is gendered because it represents the economy in ways that are more attuned to men's experience, and it takes that as the norm. In today's seminar, we'll focus on austerity, a macroeconomic policy that has been intermittently shaping women's lives in many countries throughout the world since at least the 1980s. Austerity is shorthand for cuts to public expenditure, usually accompanied by rises in broad-based consumption taxes like VAT. Ostensibly, this policy is aimed at reducing deficits in government budgets and bringing down the ratio of public debt to GDP. But other policies that might help with this aim, such as raising taxes on wealth and on income from wealth, tend not to be introduced. It's austerity for the many, but it's currently accompanied by luxury for the few. So there's a range of policies that could, if the aim really is to just reduce budget deficits and reduce the debt to GDP ratios, there's a lot of policies that could help with that are not being implemented, and there are other policies that are being implemented. Now, mainstream macroeconomists argue that austerity is necessary to make government budgets and debts financially sustainable. But they pay no attention to whether these policies are compatible with the sustainability of human well-being. As I argued in 1991 in my book on male bias in the development process, it's almost as if they assume that women's unpaid work is capable of making good all the social deficits that austerity-led reduction of budget deficits entails. But do the facts support this implicit assumption? I think that's one of the things we'll be exploring. The public is often told that austerity is necessary using folksy analogies. The government has maxed out the national credit card. The country has been living beyond its means. And like a thrifty housewife, it must cut back on spending. Angela Merkel was always very fond of the metaphor of the thrifty housewife when she was discussing macroeconomic policy. But are these analogies correct? If a thrifty housewife cuts spending, this will not impact on her household's income. But if the government cuts public spending, it will, other things being equal, reduce the level of national output and the tax revenue that accrues to the government. In fact, it could end up increasing, not reducing the budget deficit, increasing the debt to GDP ratio, not reducing it. So surely there must be alternatives. And that's what we're here to discuss. Here to discuss these issues, we have three distinguished panelists: Diane Perrins, Professor Emerita in Feminist Political Economy at the London School of Economics; Odile Maquet, Senior Lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand's School of Governance in South Africa; and Bhumika Mutala, Political Economist and Senior Advisor at Third World Network, who's based in New York. The bios of our three distinguished panelists are now been put in the chat, so you can see more detail about their expertise. So I'm going to start off with a question for Diane Perrins. Diane, in your recent book, Austerity Gendered, which is a fantastic overview of this whole issue that we're discussing, you trace the channels of austerity policies' gendered impacts. Can you summarize for us the ways in which the current extent of austerity policies globally, I know you've been keeping an eye on this, the extent of these policies globally, and then the ways in which austerity policies have gendered impacts? Over to you, Diane.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this event. I think it's quite ironic in a way that while the state is necessary to prevent economic breakdowns, as soon as the immediate crisis has passed, we're back to markets, financial orthodoxy and austerity. And at present, based on the evidence collected by Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings from IMF country reports and projections about budgets, Austerity is being practiced in at least 143 countries, and it's expected to last until at least 2025. It's estimated to impact on 85% of the world's population, including some of the poorest countries, which are likely to be the most adversely affected. And as Diane has indicated, there's no real evidence to suggest it will be effective. Both recent evidence from the financial crisis and past historical evidence from the 1930s suggests it will not be. Yet these policies have uneven gendered impacts to the disadvantage of women. Now, first of all, it's very critical to point out that the impact of austerity depends very much on who you are, where you are, and what you do. So the outcomes are very varied by social class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, age, disability, caste, and any other indicators of social disadvantage. And where these characteristics intersect, then the adverse impacts are compounded. According to the society where you live, level of income, its economic and political structure, by occupation or life survival strategy. So it's important to recognize that the outcomes of austerity are highly contingent, but because all societies are gendered, again, as Diane has indicated, and especially because of the uneven distribution of domestic labor and care and uneven power relations between women and men, the impact of austerity, while varied, is always gendered. It creates a triple jeopardy for women, especially because of the cuts in public expenditure. Women are overrepresented as public sector workers in many countries, as direct users of public services, and in some countries, they're more likely than men to be more dependent on various forms of social protection. So thinking about the cuts in employment, in most countries, and the cuts take various forms, things like capping the public sector wage bill, pay cuts and pay freezes. Apparently, again, according to Cummings and Ortiz and Cummings, these policies are being currently practiced in 91 countries. It will lead to the loss of jobs or failure to fill vacancies, which leads to overwork, or in some cases, the use of agency staff, which is typically more expensive. So again, the strategy is economically irrational. It leads to a decline in the quality of services provided. Workers have to deal with patients and clients who are increasingly dissatisfied, and they feel dissatisfied themselves that they're unable to perform their roles as effectively as they would like to. So while these people were applauded as key workers during the pandemic, their reward is overwork and underpay. Turning to cuts in social protection and support, social protection expenditure is likely to hit. Again, 120 countries are likely to be affected by this, and women are more likely to be affected than men because social protection, they're more reliant on social protection, especially elderly people and lone parents. The cuts take the form of direct cuts in payments or freezes in payments, changes in entitlement criteria. In the UK, payments to families with third children, the child element was removed. If you have too many children, you're not seen as being deserving. And the conditions are attached to receiving benefits, and sanctions for non-compliance with these conditions were really heavily enforced. And this leads to impoverishment, even in wealthy countries such as the UK. And in addition to sort of direct payments, there's cuts or elimination of subsidies to various aspects of life, food, housing, utilities, and that apparently is taking place in 80 countries. And then you have cuts in public sector services. Women are more likely than men to be the direct users of public sector services, so more immediately affected by the cuts. They're typically reduced in the extent, provision, and entitlement, or not keeping up with rising costs. 16 countries are reducing health expenditure at a time when health is under pressure. Public services are privatized, or elements are privatized. That's affecting 79 countries. And this will typically lead to higher costs, user fees, poorer quality, and deterioration of working conditions for employees. At the same time, private profits are extracted, increasing inequality. In the UK, private equity companies are now involved in the provision of social care and extracting huge amounts of money in various financial arrangements that they make. And then the decline in the quality of services leads some people to switch to the private sector, those able to, and that potentially leads to a two-tier provision service with low-income people very much dependent on a residual welfare state. And this is particularly invidious cuts because many of these cuts don't make sense. The UK cut a childcare service in the period following the financial crisis, only to find now that following COVID and Brexit, it doesn't have a big enough labour force. So it's thinking about introducing new services, but probably with poorer conditions for the employees. In addition, there were cuts to survivors of domestic violence. And again, this is likely to intensify. It affected many countries during the COVID crisis, and it's likely to increase with the cost of living crisis simply because people can't escape, women can't escape the perpetrators. And again, these studies are the cuts are economically irrational. There was a study by the UK government researchers that found that the cost of domestic violence was incredible, something like 80 billion a year, far greater than providing support. And finally, when public services are cut, it leads to increases in unpaid labour for women, and which can have a devastating effect on their lifetime earnings, their pension entitlements, and it increases their exposure in future crises. It also lowers women's independence, their voice in household and community decision-making, their presence in positions of power, including political power and economic policy making, and reflects this unequal power relations between women and men. Now, while the presence of women in political and economic power would not inevitably change policies, widening representation to include people with more varied experiences of life is almost certainly to lead to some different policy choices, such as how the pandemic crisis was dealt with, how the cost of living crisis is dealt with. And so, the effects of austerity are highly gendered. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diane. I think you've given us these really shocking figures about how widespread austerity is, and there are very few countries which have not got plans to cut public expenditure, and lots of them have already been cutting expenditure a lot already. And you've also, I think, highlighted this triple jeopardy that women face as predominantly employees of the public sector, as users of public services more than men, and as users of social protection transfers more than men, and how that's compounded these problems. And you've also drawn attention to the fact that some of these so-called economically necessary policies actually turn out to be quite economically irrational. They turn out to be false economies, and that's maybe something we can explore further in our discussions. I'm now going to turn to Odile Mackett. Odile, as we look to understand the impacts of austerity within country-specific contexts, what can you tell us about the austerity policies that you've had in South Africa?
Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you to IFE for the privilege of being part of this very esteemed panel and on this very interesting and urgent topic. In order to sort of understand the South African context, it's good to have an idea of the transition from the apartheid era to the post-apartheid era. I won't go into the details of that, but I will touch on that here and there where I can to understand, the current situation in South Africa. So like many countries around the world, South Africa was a victim of the Washington Consensus neoliberal policy wave in the 1980s and the 1990s. which also happened to be the era in which the apartheid regime was sort of falling apart. So it's been written that in the post-apartheid era, economic relations remained largely untransformed from the apartheid era. And this is in part due to the foresight of many large conglomerates who reached out to leaders in the African National Congress, who is our majority political party, the liberators of our democracy, during the 1980s as the apartheid regime was coming apart at the seams. So although there's a lot that happened during the run-up to the first democratic election in 1994, in essence, what was agreed on is very neatly outlined by Jeffrey Schneider in an article he wrote. He basically said, you know, that there was an acceptance of the state apartheid era debt by the new government. There was opening of financial markets in combination with retrenchments, reduction in public sector wages and cuts in infrastructure spending. There was a reduction in tariffs and embracing free trade policies during that time. Privatization of the large state sectors constructed by the apartheid era regime. And most importantly, no significant redistribution of economic benefits from those who benefit during the apartheid era to those who had been denied these privileges for many years. On the other hand, South Africa simultaneously expanded social safety nets for large parts of the population going into the democratic era. So they sort of built on some of the infrastructure that was there during the apartheid era, by paying out cash transfers to caregivers of children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. This program really grew to include Black people and gradually increase the age band for children. So today, caregivers with children under the age of 18 who can pass a means test is eligible for a grant. And in May 2021, these grants were paid out to more than 18 million beneficiaries. So that's a lot of people in a population of just under 60 million people, but also shows how many poor people there are, given that all those people need to pass the means tests. So although they've had this expansive social grants program, the government has skimped on other forms of social spending. In fact, some scholars have accused the South African National Treasury of fiscal consolidation by stealth since 2012. So they've sort of sneaked in the fiscal consolidation. So in South Africa, austerity has been justified, as I'm sure in many other countries, through concerns around the rising debt burden and a monetary policy stance, which is committed to staying within an inflation band at all costs. Ironically, neither of these are comparatively serious concerns in the bigger scheme of things. So although about the government's debt burden, Busi Sibeko, a South African feminist economist, has argued that South Africa doesn't really have a debt crisis as the National Treasury would like us to believe. She wrote that in 2019, South Africa's debt was moderate by international standards and broadly in line with its economic peers such as Colombia, India, Morocco, and Brazil. Regarding inflation, South Africa, as many countries do, has an arbitrary target of between 3% and 6%. Yet this target is pursued very vigorously. This is despite the high unemployment rate and the fact that many South African households are heavily indebted. In 2015, Patrick Bond, a political economist, wrote that household debt to disposable income ratios increased from 50% to 80% between 2005 and 2008. And many households also borrow from informal predatory lenders, specifically those who don't have access to formal financial institutions. And most of these households use the bulk of the credit to buy food. And despite the number of these social issues, including the fact that 10% of the population owns more than 80% of the country's wealth, and the unemployment rate is at 33% at the end of last year. If you include the discouraged work seekers, it goes all the way up to 43%. The state has implemented very peculiar fiscal stances. So the first is that South Africa's marginal tax rates to the top income group declined gradually from 50% in the 1960s to 41% by 2015. In addition to this, the corporate tax rate declined from 40% in the 1980s to 28% in 2014, and this further declined to 27% in 2021. So this has encouraged a very profitable private sector, of which the financial sector is the fastest growing sector. On the other hand, there's been an increase in the value-added tax rate, or our sales tax, which we all know is a regressive tax, from 14% to 15% in 2018. So this is the first such increase in the post-apartheid period. And these have been accompanied by a number of additional cuts, most of which impact women most significantly. So, for an example, during the COVID pandemic, the government made cuts to non-profit organizations who provide early childhood development programs, which led to the closure of a lot of those centers. So many of these would be run by women, but also because women tend to be primary caregivers, the closure of these centers would also severely affect them. In addition to this, over the longer term, these austerity measures are also reflected in the failures in indirect state transfers through spending on health and education. But what is most notable for women, as I only have 1 minute left, is that they are most in need of resources which are taken away through budget cuts. Many South African hospitals have a high number of vacant posts and have experienced a decline in services delivered to patients. In addition to this, the share of spending on education, for instance, by government decreased in recent years from 20.9% in 2013 to 14.4% in 2019. So wherever there's a gap to plug in the macroeconomic policy, it's usually the households who do that. And because women tend to be the primary laborers and caregivers in households, they then end up carrying the economy in times of austerity. I think I will leave it at that because I think my time's up now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Odile. I think you've given us a really good feel for how South African government is expecting women to be the safety net of last resort. And it's also household debt. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think this is happening in so many countries and all the focus tends to be on government debt, but actually the policies that governments are introducing, which they say are to reduce debt, just transfer the debt, don't they? They just mean that households are running up more and more debt. And also you highlighted the tax policy in South Africa, that not only did they raise, as we would normally expect, the taxes like VAT on the grounds they have to reduce the deficit, but they cut taxes for the rich and for the corporations. We had the same thing in the UK at the time when they were really pursuing strong austerity policies after the financial crisis, cutting back all the public services. At the same time, they were cutting income tax and cutting corporation tax. So I think we have to look out for the complexity of the tax side in what countries do on austerity. And you brought that out very clearly for us, I think. So thanks very much, Odile. I'm now going to turn to our final panelist. I'm going to go back to them all again for another question after this, but I'm going to turn next to Bhumika. Bhumika, your works included a case study on the impacts of austerity in Ecuador in the COVID context. Can you share with us the key takeaways from that analysis, particularly regarding gendered austerity?
Thank you, Diane. And likewise, I'm extremely thrilled to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues and on this topic that is of critical urgency today, as we are really in the throes of a new era of austerity. So Ecuador, I would like to share that this is based on studies that were conducted, field research as well as interviews during the time of COVID between 2020 and 2021 up to early 2022 that were conducted virtually for the most part, as well as desk research. So that's been the methodology of this study. Ecuador is one of the 221 loans that were arranged with 88 developing countries by the IMF as of August 2021. So a bit of context is that Ecuador's loan with the IMF goes far, precedes the COVID era. It starts in 2017 and has been renegotiated several times in 2019 and then again in 2021. The current loan is called an extended fund facility loan. It is of merely 6.5 billion, but it is of 27 months. And it is, most importantly, a precondition for the restructuring of the 17.4 billion of the nation's debt with international creditors. And this restructuring took place, governed and facilitated by the IMF, since Ecuador is not eligible for the G20 debt restructuring process, and this was done in 2021. So the context of the indebtedness of Ecuador as a dollarized economy is like many global South countries in the years, in the years following the global financial crisis. There was a glut of liquidity. Quantitative easing is what the economic pundits called it, is when a lot of cheap credit at a record historical low interest rate of 0.25% went searching for higher yields all across the global South, which were offering much higher interest rates. And this flood of credit being offered by the private sector is what has led to the sovereign debt crisis we are situated in today, which compels and leaves a choiceless equation of global South countries having to go to the IMF for bailout loans, for financial assistance that comes with austerity conditions. So that's the larger context in which Ecuador, like many countries, is in indebtedness due to that period of quantitative easing where there was just an unprecedented amount of debt with private creditors as opposed to bilateral, multilateral, previous eras of debt of indebtedness. So with that context, the IMF's loan with Ecuador, I'm just going to share a few of the stipulations and then talk about the gendered implications on 3 particular channels. Here's an overview of the stipulations. Public expenditure cuts focused on the public wage bill amounting to 4.2% of GDP between 2020, 2022, and 2025. The privatization of state assets to generate a source of medium-term financing focused on state-owned enterprises. Let's note, this harks back not just to the IMF loans in the global financial crisis era, but actually to the structural adjustment program era. The loans today resemble the structural adjustment era of the 1980s more than any of the loans in the past 20 years. This is also an erosion of the developmental state. A decrease in the official minimum wage, which actually goes against Ecuador's constitution, which calls for enshrining a living wage level that is in alignment with Buen Vivir principles. So a lot of these stipulations go against the very constitution. Decreases in pensions, as my peers mentioned, liberalization of public procurement. This may sound vague and somewhat technical, but liberalization of public procurement opens the door to all kinds of foreign investors and foreign companies in the running of the nation. A key condition in the loan, or key recommendation in the loan, is on monetary tightening, which in today's environment is very critical. And I'm going to read out the exact language, which is supplanting interest rate ceilings in private banks with a system of bands. Translation, in other words, enabling private banks to charge higher interest rates to their borrowers. Now, this excludes the women at the intersections of marginality, since they don't actually have accounts with private banks, but it is a testament to the kind of monetary tightening embedded into the loan structure. Improving the compliance of regressive taxes, particularly value-added taxation. Another very important issue that we need to talk about more within feminist economics is greater independence for the central bank. And this has been a massive debate within Ecuador, leading to protests and all kinds of governmental debates. So in other words, the reduced ability of Ecuador's central bank to provide emergency liquidity for pandemic and economic recovery. Expanding foreign investment in resource extraction, particularly lithium mining. And the last one I leave you with in the sort of overview of the conditions is there is a footnote that states that domestic savings generated from the above measures to achieve fiscal surplus cannot be channeled into public investments, quote unquote, including for climate change adaptation. So here we see a profound link to climate financing and policy space, domestic and national policy space for addressing climate change exigencies. So we see as a whole, these conditions are really impinging fundamentally on all levels of economic sovereignty. Now, again, these conditions have to be negotiated within the government, within the country, but this is the sort of recommendations being doled out within loans and within surveillance. The first channel I'll talk about is the gendered implications of austerity on public health in Ecuador. Ecuador is an extreme case study. It's a shocking example of the extreme effects of the reduction in public investment in healthcare. Between 2017 and 2019, there was a 64% reduction in public investment in healthcare. Now, 60% of workers in the national health sector are women. 85% in the nursing profession are women. The chronic lack of investment in the national public health system then led to Ecuador experiencing one of the most devastating impacts of the pandemic anywhere in the world. In June 2020, the Financial Times placed Ecuador first in the world ranking of excess mortality in the height of the COVID deaths. Meanwhile, the civil registry nationally documented 20,000 excess deaths during the first several months of the COVID crisis. Now, while this mortality figure cannot be ascribed entirely to the COVID virus, they do constitute the excess victims from other serious or chronic ailments that could have been treated if the health system resilience had not been eroded due to layoffs and budget reductions. In 2019 alone, 3,680 public health workers, such as doctors, nurses, auxiliary nurses, stretcher bearers, social workers, were dismissed. This is about 5% of total employment in the Ministry of Health. Despite protests by the National Syndicate of Healthcare Workers, this is the National Union of Healthcare Workers in Ecuador, such dismissals of essential health workers continued during the pandemic well into 2020. The ILO, in its review of the country and its health system, stated that in Ecuador, the state budget allocated to health did not reflect the greater needs of the health emergency generated. This is 2021. In the same year, in September 2021, the IMF wrote in its third review of the loan, "We congratulate the government for a lower national deficit in 2020. This is a result of its exemplary performance in the reduction of spending in the non-financial public sector." And I'm quoting only to show just, how explicit the directives of austerity are. The impacts on reproductive health are especially significant. The National Institute of Statistics and Censuses reported a maternal mortality rate in 2019 of 30.
Can I intervene a minute to say, I think you've got a minute left, So if you could.
Sure. So to summarize, the reproductive impacts were very severe. The maternal mortality rate increased from 37 deaths per 100,000 women in 2019 to about 57.6 deaths. This regressed the clock on maternal health by a full decade. I wanted to share what Patricia Calderon, who is the union leader at one of the largest public hospitals in Quito, she shared how extraneous costs of the pandemic were borne by female healthcare workers. When they had to quarantine, they had to rent small hotel rooms out of their own budgets in order to avoid infecting their families in close living quarters. She says, "My peers who are single mothers also had to pay for childcare. Meanwhile, the rooms within the hospital were not made available for health workers, and neither was food. The hospital had no surplus funds. Everything was being spent." And I also, in conclusion, want to mention another aspect that was also alluded to before, which was gendered consumer debt, where low-income women particularly have accumulated a very significant level of private debt, where they're not in the formal banking system and where they have no choice but to go to predatory lenders who charge much higher interest rates, the notorious loan sharks. On average, the daily interest rate in this informal credit market is 3.4%, which amounts to 103% a month. So women have been resisting, they've been organizing, they've been forming savings communities where they collectivize their debt. and where they have a sort of maximum loan limit of $500. It's a dollarized economy. This has been one way of organizing around that private debt. And what is the debt used for? This is the key question we kept asking. What is leading to the private debt? And it was overwhelmingly accessing health services, where public hospitals were filled up and they had to go to private hospitals. One woman talked about the final bill coming to USD $35,000, where the entire community she lives in had to collectivize in order to figure out a payment plan. And this is because they had no choice but to take her father to a private health clinic where he had to stay for a full month. She said it will be virtually impossible to repay such a high debt. So I leave you with this. There's also a lot on care work and time poverty, but to emphasize the public health and the consumer debt in light of the public spending retrenchment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bhumika. I'm glad you brought monetary policy into the picture, and I hope that there will be a subsequent session in this online events on macroeconomic policy that will speak particularly to monetary policy. But I think it's worth recognizing that whereas the austerity, that fiscal austerity that happened immediately after the financial crisis was accompanied by monetary, but very loose monetary policy, as you indicated. That's not the case now. We're getting tightening monetary policy and tightening fiscal policy at the same time, and we need to be aware of that. And I think the Ecuador case also really shows this contrast between the focus on debt sustainability, ostensibly, and complete disregard for the sustainability of human life. So it's a very dramatic contrast. But one final point, I've read this study, so I know it's a very interesting methodology, and I think it's worth just pointing that out too. You did allude to it right at the beginning. I mean, it's a mixture of using data from secondary sources and also qualitative data from interviews with health service workers. And I think that's really interesting, because very often when we're trying to investigate the gendered impacts of austerity policies, we can't find exactly what we want in the official statistics. And very often we've got to supplement that with the testimony of the people who are at the sharp end of this. And I think that comes out very strongly when you read that Ecuador study. And at the last thing you said was really alluding to issues of resistance and alternatives. And that's the issue I want to talk to now. And I want to come back to all the panelists and ask if they can share some thoughts on feminist economic alternatives to austerity. Ones that we might not be able to go into great detail in this seminar, but we want to put a marker down. They might be able to be taken up in more detail in subsequent seminars. So it's really important to put that issue of alternatives in the face of a narrative and a discourse of macroeconomic policy, which so often says there is no alternative. So can I first turn to Diane to comment on that, and then Odile, and then back to you, Bhumika.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I mean, there's no shortage of alternative proposals, ranging from immediate policies to deal with debt differently to transformative ideas about creating environmentally sustainable, inclusive and equitable societies. But I think moving towards those transformations would require really revolutionary changes to challenge existing power relations. And I think, although as the saying goes, it's not possible to make an omelette or tortilla without breaking any eggs, I think it's very important to bring about change in inclusive ways. And hearing the previous contributions, it really is very clear how very marginal changes will make huge differences. So it's with that sort of qualification in mind that I'm thinking about these alternative possibilities. First of all, I mean, it is important to reduce debt, or the credit agencies will charge so much interest that so much of government revenue will have to go on financing repayments. But as Diane alluded to at the beginning, there are many ways of reducing debt without necessarily causing austerity. First of all, some countries still hold on to sovereign wealth funds and too high foreign exchange reserves, which could be used to offset some of the debt. Also, the IMF could offset some debt by, using the special drawing rights, but these should be in hard currencies and used to promote investment in socially useful projects, not to pay back creditors, which some of the loans are used for at the moment. There's ways of restructuring debt, which countries have done, obviously, debt swaps, cancellation or repudiation when loans seem to have been unfairly negotiated. But if there are new loans, it's very important to ensure greater transparency and ensure that they're used for social programs and subject to public accountability, and also subject to gender responsive budgeting. There are some immediate alternatives. A global financial transaction tax could raise, a small tax would raise a huge amount. You could increase the progressiveness of taxes. Taxes on high incomes are currently, especially in Europe and North America, are far lower than they were in the 1980s. And this is often done at times of national crisis, such as wars. The rates are about 20% higher. I suppose it's 4 decades ago now, but the progressiveness of income tax could be changed. But I also think it's important to address wage structures, ex ante before tax, and try to think of ways that wages could reflect real social values rather than a kind of the present unequal gendered social norms. The ways in which the incomes of CEOs and financiers, they in the UK, I think it was estimated that a CEO only had to work 3 days to earn the entire annual earnings of a care worker who with 20 years of experience. So this huge wage inequality that needs to be addressed. But I think probably, if one thing was to be focused on, it perhaps should be a wealth tax. Sorry, that was a different WhatsApp I got that I think I got then. Oxfam recommends wealth tax. They point out that between 2019 and 2021, the richest 1% have pocketed nearly twice as much wealth as the other 99% of the population. And that even a 5% tax on the world's multimillionaires and billionaires, so not many people, could lift 2 million people out of poverty. And it may require, it would require international coordination, but it's just so evident that a tiny change to a small number of people would make such a huge difference. And that, if one's thinking of campaigns on a broader scale, that this might be something that could be pursued. Thomas Piketty also recommends a wealth tax. He shows that debt, especially in high-income countries, is rarely a question of absolute wealth, but one of distribution between the public and private sector. And that for these reasons, he recommends that debt be resolved by a tax on capital. And he points out that Europe has one of the highest levels of private wealth per capita in the world, and yet has debt problems. So it's this distribution between public and private sector. Similarly, Keynes also maintained that rent or interest payments was a distributional issue, and this is quoting him, and arose from the cumulative oppressive power of the capitalist to exploit its scarcity rather than any idea of entrepreneurial merit. And he argued that there was no real reason why capital should be scarce. Rather, he thought it possible for communal savings through the state to be maintained at a level which would allow investment in, socially desirable things. And this, links into the idea of national investment banks being used to support democratically determined needs. But in any case, it's particularly important to think about ways of tackling the extreme levels of inequality within countries as well as and between countries, and to reallocate existing, arguably unnecessary public expenditure towards social programs, financing some kind of people's recovery, or moving towards a green and caring economy and inclusive economy, as the UK's Women's Budget Group recommends. Oh, sorry, I told to finish. I didn't realise that was long. I looked at the other things.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
So, thank you, Diane, for lots of ideas. I think, and really bringing out the issue of inequalities in income and wealth as being central, and tackling those as being essential to alternatives. Of course, wealth is held concentrated in the hands of a very small minority in all countries, and it's all the data that we've got suggests that although women, of course, do own some wealth, there are some rich women, there are far fewer of them than there are of men. So wealth tax is a very gendered issue, both in terms of who would pay it and also in terms of what it could fund and how it would avoid these terrible things like the cuts to the health services that we've been hearing about. Can I turn to Adil now for your reflections and alternatives?
Thanks, Diane. So my recommendation is far more conservative. So as a time use researcher, I always think about how do we save people time, right? Because as women, we often pay with our time when there's a gap in spending or service delivery or whatever. And I always think about this quote from the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Economics by Ipek and Emil, where they say that time is acknowledged as the universal input necessary for anything, and hence the ultimate currency for equality and justice. So we can think about the time it takes for someone to access services which allow them to exercise their basic human rights. So in South Africa, we could take healthcare as an example. It's difficult to fathom how someone who needs to take an entire day off work to go to a clinic and seek treatment could reasonably exercise their other cultural, social, and economic rights. So people who rely on poorly delivered public services or are victims of non-delivery in public services cannot invest in the skills needed, to secure jobs and other services which would ensure their well-being. And the same goes for care. If there are no alternatives for childcare, for instance, women can't go to work, they can't self-reproduce, the list goes on. So where government does not deliver services, people have to pay with their time, whether it be standing in a clinic or hospital queue, or waiting for a grant to be paid, or having to fetch water because there's no running water in a household, or having to make fire because there's no electricity. All these things take time. So when services are not delivered by markets or the government, households have to deliver them. And often, I repeat, it's the woman in the household to give their time to deliver these services. So in South Africa, for instance, we have, despite all our austerity measures, we have what we call free basic education and a form of universal healthcare, in addition to one of the most expansive social grants program. But the government keeps stealing people's time by delivering them poorly, or now declining the extent to which they are delivered. So the point being is that, from my perspective, it's not just how do we get to a point of delivery, but efficient delivery of services goes a long way, providing in quality infrastructure, not just infrastructure. But what does that mean in the context of austerity, right? Where governments have a lot of competing interests. Obviously, they're more interested in serving some interest than others. I have, for instance, just a personal anecdote. I've heard some middle-class South Africans say, for instance, they would be happy to pay more taxes if it meant that they could drive to work and not find a pothole, or all the traffic lights were working perfectly fine. So my question is, what would private firms and the wealthy be willing to pay for if things were delivered efficiently? So I'm not saying that infrastructure development is going to solve all our problems, or that we need good reasons to justify taxing the wealthy more, but working infrastructure is to everyone's benefit. So in a fractured society with so many competing demands, I think it's important to find things that are beneficial for most, if not for all. But like I said, very conservative, but one way of thinking about it.
No, I wouldn't call that conservative, Odile. I'd call that a really realistic approach in terms of how do we get a broad enough coalition of people to agree to pay more taxes. And you're absolutely right of making the link between the kind of taxes that people pay and the quality of the public services that they get is a really important thing to think about when we're trying to construct alternatives. Because of course that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but is one of the reasons why people resist paying more taxes, because they say it's not going to provide quality services. But it was also interesting the way you brought in the issue of time use into the construction of alternatives and thinking about investment and economic policy in terms of what it means for people's time, their unpaid time as well as their paid time. And I think that has to be at the heart of feminist alternatives as well. So thank you. And Bhumika, we turn to you now for the a word on alternatives before we move to the Q&A session.
Thanks, Diane. Yes, following the two other speakers and everything you've said, Diane, fiscal policy alternatives, there's actually a vast terrain. There's no dearth. And I would like to just list out 8 as just a few examples to begin with, and then focus on one of them. So I'll just list out 8. First, a reformulation and indeed a redefinition of fiscal policy, and a greater embrace of expansionary macro policies to finance public services, social protection, workers' rights. Second, sovereign debt restructuring on a multilateral basis involving all creditors and a debt cancellation prospect. Third, progressive taxation on the wealthy, the flip opposite of regressive taxation. So income, capital assets, real estate, and indeed even inheritance. And to couple this with tackling corporate tax evasion and avoidance. So progressive taxation is not just looking at communities and income, but also on the more systemic level, where so many trillions in corporate revenues that are rightfully the public financial resources of the spaces and places that they operate in, being funneled into tax havens and all sorts of cooking the books, as they call it. Universal social protections and universal social protection systems is really about a comprehensive welfare strategy. And this is at odds with the sort of advice being offered by the IMF and indeed the World Bank and a lot of international institutions that focus solely on targeted, temporary, and conditional transfers. If you look at a lot of the documentation in the financial institutions, you'll find these 3 terms over and over again when alluding to transfers: targeted, temporary, and conditional. And especially in the COVID era, there seems to be a fixation on targeted, because there is a very powerful narrative that universal protection of any sort, universal transfers, universal systems will waste resources on the rich. There will be a wasteful spending of public financial resources that are scarce and precious on the rich, and that it needs to be targeted to the poor. And in this targeting, we've also done qualitative field research and some studies in Pakistan, for example, which is facing a real crisis in social protection systems, where the conditions attached to social transfers left out many, the bureaucracy as well as the conditions. I want to also then mention trade union rights and collective bargaining. I think we don't talk about trade union rights enough when it comes to gendered austerity, but I want to mention in particular that in Ecuador, the education sector, the public education sector, was not as badly affected by budget cuts. And we asked why. We asked the nurses, we asked women that we interviewed, and we asked policymakers why. And overwhelmingly, the actual reason, when you got down to it, after a lot of rhetoric, was that the education sector has a far stronger trade union and a far stronger collective bargaining contract. The contract of collective bargaining is stronger and more firmly in place in the education sector. So there is, to some degree, a correlation between robust union presence and vulnerability to budget cuts. This is an area that requires far greater exploration, it's an exciting correlation if it also exists in many other contexts. And then ex ante and ex post human rights impact assessments, and this means disaggregating data not just by gender but also by class, by race, by all markers of intersectionality, this would also connect to transparent, participatory, and gender-responsive budgeting processes, and in line with participation, national dialogue with social movements, trade unions, feminist movements, youth movements, and civil society. Such national dialogue cannot be emphasized enough. This has been a very key part of civil society advocacy as well. So much of what is negotiated around austerity is in the dark. The people, society does not always receive the information. It's not, these conditions are not printed out in the local newspaper. And the last thing I want to really emphasize, and there are many, I'm just pointing out a few that I've spent some time talking about and thinking about. The last one I think is especially critical, is epistemic decolonization, really tackling neoclassical economics and that there is no alternative mantra by reviving a plurality of economic and social knowledge systems in which feminist economics is at the center. But we also need to bring back strands of Marxist political economy and critical theory in political economy. There is a lot of work to be done in broadening the horizons of how economics is pursued and studied, and what kinds of assumptions, what kind of basis of knowledge we use. And with that, I'll conclude by also highlighting one of the key things I've spent some time talking about, including in the case study on Ecuador and gendered austerity in the Gender and Development Journal, is the reformulation of fiscal policy. Now, this follows many macroeconomic.
I think we're probably
wrap up.
If you could wrap up, because we're going to move to the Q&A. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
Just in 1 minute, I would say, I think this reorientation involves seeing public spending as investment rather than consumption. And so I just leave you with that. If we can move beyond, we can move from the categorization of fiscal policy as discretionary and short-term consumption to long-term investment that incorporates a regenerative interaction, or the feedback loop, between public investment in services, public systems, and social infrastructure, the care economy, and economic and social development, and greater degrees of social equality. And so this is sort of what I would leave with as the sort of the big cake on alternatives, is this reformulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhumika. I mean, a wealth of specific policies, but also this question of how we change the narrative, how we change the understandings among economists, among politicians, among civil servants, among the public, and this policy we've been trying, with a little bit of success in the UK, to get them to think of, say, spending on care services as investment and not consumption, and that's making some inroads now. And also, progressive economists in the UK wrote to the BBC complaining about the coverage of economic policy on the BBC, and how it uncritically bought into this neoclassical narrative about there is no alternative, you've got to have austerity. And now the BBC commissioned a report from two people who were not mainstream neoclassical economists, have come up with a very good report about all these issues, the false narratives, and how it might change the narrative. And the signs are the BBC will take some of that on board. So I think these ideas about how we can change the narratives are really important. But now I know we've got lots of participants. I think we've got 45 or more people patiently waiting to ask their questions. I can see there are some already in the chat, and I think there's also a raising hands facility that you can also use. So please put your questions in the chat or use the raise hand function. Mary will call upon people to put questions. Please make them succinct and to the point so we can fit in as many as possible. And we'll take 3 questions at a time and ask panelists to respond before moving on to the next 3 questions. So Mary, over to you to organize this Q&A session.
Wonderful. It looks like we have some hands up from Beatrice and Alicia. So we'll go to them first, and then we do have a couple in the chat. So I'll go to one in the chat after you two ask your questions.
No, I only want to, well, I'm very happy to be here. I want to congratulate IAFE to organize this session. And while I was here in Bhumika, well, it's not only Ecuador, it's Latin America. And of course, all the adjustments problem had been criminalized women. And well, that will be my comment. Congratulations. I'm very happy. I would like to later on see la grabación because it is very important. Thank you very much. And congratulations, Diane. Bye.
Beatrice, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much all for a great presentation and so interesting and relevant. And I work for the Swedish Women's Lobby, and we're really pushing this right now to the opposition in our parliament. So this is very helpful to us on the ground. A question I have is I just finished writing a report about the Swedish tax system, and I found it difficult to argue for a wealth tax that is not based on revenue from wealth, but the very capital, because I found that it was more equally divided than wealth revenue because women own where they live. Real estate or housing is in large owned in Sweden, so women were disproportionately taxed with when there was a tax on capital, or this was the conclusion that I drew from a lack of data. But do you have any recommendations regarding how one would introduce a wealth tax or a capital tax, and which assets are important to include, and are there any expectations or exceptions that should be made in a wealth tax?
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And then I'm going to read a couple from the chat that we'll have our participants answer. And then Umberto, I see you have your hand up, so we'll come to you in the next round. So from the chat from Thoko Medoko, it is important to note that since around 2012, South Africa's national treasury has been pursuing a fiscal policy via an expenditure ceiling, which has resulted in constrained public spending with cuts in social spending. At the same time, as Diane has mentioned, cutting CIT and PIT and increasing VAT, and often prioritizing debt surfacing. Often the argument is that if they don't pursue austerity, the debt will become unsustainable. A question I have is, what is the best way to counter this argument in the face of such incredible levels of inequality and impoverishment? So the second question in the chat, I think, was also a bit about kind of this narrative piece. And so Juliana Martinez Frenzoni says hello from Costa Rica. One matter we face in Latin America as elsewhere is the persuasive power of austerity narratives. How do we use the evidence and alternatives available to feed alternative narratives that capture the imagination of feminist actors and other progressive actors? So I'll turn it now to the panel. Maybe since one of the questions was specific to South Africa, Odile, I'll start with you.
Thanks, and thank you so much, Thokozile, for the question. I don't have an answer, but I do have a question around sustainability and unsustainability, right? Which is what they tell us how debt is. I wonder, like, what is the definition of debt being unsustainable, right? Because I'm again reading from Busi Sibeko's working paper series here. She says that, she says, according to the IMF, this was written in 2019, emerging market and middle income country debt levels are projected to reach an average of 61.2%, while advanced country debt averaged 104% of GDP in 2019. I also went to the IMF's debt database. The US debt as a percentage of GDP is 130%. Canada, 113%, France, 112%, the list goes on. So my question is there like a different definition of unsustainability for the global South and the global North? And my second question there would be, I understand how a household might become unsustainable in terms of debt, but in a global financial system where we literally make money out of thin air, why does any of that become unsustainable, right? Because people just keep finding new ways to create money, they write debt off. And the last thing is, if we're thinking about, okay, yes, at some point someone's going to have to pay for all of this, right? So if we think about apartheid like being not just a small interest group of right-wing Afrikaners, oppressing people, but actually as a post-colonial project, which was financed by the World Bank and the IMF, can we not start talking about restitution if we need money? So if our debt is becoming unsustainable. So that would just be my response to the unsustainability. I'm not going to answer wealth tax because I don't know anything about that, but thank you so much.
Wonderful. I'll turn it to Diane next and then Bhumika, and I'll just ask if you can please try and keep your answers concise, as it looks like we have 2 other questions. So Diane, over to you.
So in response to, what kind of level conditions should be attached to wealth tax? I mean, I think I haven't, I'm not an expert on wealth tax at all, but reading Tom R. Piketty's book, Capital, he does provide what I recall as being quite quite a sensible account about how a global wealth tax might be introduced. So I would recommend reading that. It's towards the end of his massive tome called Capital. But I think it's important to tackle total assets and not just income from wealth, because wealth holders often draw down a very small proportion of the wealth. So it is important to tackle the total assets. But I mean, you could start it, to begin with at a very high level. So people's houses and things of that kind were excluded. In terms of ideas about unsustainable debt, I think it's very arguable, what the level is, and if there is a level. I mean, it depends on the GDP ratio. So if you're expanding GDP, not that I like GDP, not that it measures well-being, but setting the growth argument aside, if you are moving forward as an economy, debt automatically falls. I mean, the UK, I think, had really, really high debts after the Second World War, and these eroded at a time when the government was developing a national health service. So I mean, it depends very much what debt is used for.
Thank you so much, Diane. Over to you, Bhumika, for some brief responses.
If it's okay, I'd like to focus my response on the extremely critical aspect of debt, and that in a lot of feminist macroeconomists have been talking about the methodology of the debt sustainability assessment. So the debt sustainability assessment is what is international financial institutions, and indeed most finance ministries, use in order to assess so-called debt sustainability, the percentage of national debt as a proportion of aggregate GDP. There's been a huge push that debt sustainability assessments, or DSAs, should incorporate assessments of gender equality, human rights, and climate change commitments, as well as that generative feedback loop between public sector investments and economic and social development. And what's the argument to broaden this ambit of how the DSA is calculated? It's to incorporate social equality in order to consider the country's ability to pay its creditors without accounting for how servicing debt may undermine its ability to meet the needs of its people and international human rights obligations. So just as an example, in 2020, at the height of COVID, the IMF the International Monetary Fund assessed 76 out of 80 countries that received its immediate emergency financing during COVID to have sustainable, quote unquote, debt levels. Now, these assessments relied, they were made assuming countries will implement severe austerity measures over the coming years. So within the assessment, within the calculation, is this integral assumption. So ultimately, this, revamping the methodology is about recognizing that, public and social spending undergirds equity as a precondition for debt sustainability. So again, it's about a narrative as well as a methodology where we integrate equity into sustainability. Right now, sustainability is only really looking at repayment to private creditors. And what Odile said just very quickly is it's really about reserve currency issuers versus non-reserve currency issuers. So this is really about the international currency hierarchy and the role of the US dollar and other OECD currencies as reserve currencies that have exorbitant privileges of printing and accumulating debt, or printing money and accumulating debt without repercussions, which the Global South has no remit to.
Thank you so much, Bhumika. And in the interest of time, I see we do have 3 questions. I'm going to ask that you all keep your questions very concise. And then I'm going to turn, because I want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask them. And then I'll turn to our speakers to answer them very quickly and give their closing remarks. So Umberto, Elaine, I'll go to you first, then Elaine,
Yeah.
and Carolyn.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. I was very pleased to hear the 3 speakers, and I would like to congratulate them. And my question is around poverty targeting. So I heard from Bhumika that there is some interest in poverty targeting in this era of austerity, but we are, I work in the ILO, for those who don't know me. So basically, we are a bit worried about this shift towards poverty targeting only, because for us, social protection should be universal. And we have seen that when the system is universal, so when social protection is available for those in need, including those that are poor, of course, but for everybody that needs it, it works better than when it's targeted to the poor due to inclusion errors, or to the fact that many women, for example, we have done a study on indigenous women in all Latin America, that they have, when they try to target them, they really have struggled. So we are calling more for universalism, and this is my point. I wanted to say more, but I know time is very stretched. So over to you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Umberto. And yes, Elaine, I'll go to you next and ask that you please keep your question as concise as possible.
Okay. So first of all, hi to 2 decades-old friend, Diane Nelson. I haven't seen you in so long, Diane. And Bhumika, of course, we stay in touch a lot. Bhumika, you mentioned, and I just want to pick up on that, it's not just the IMF, it's also the World Bank. So I want to ask the speakers, because we have examples for sure from Ecuador and South Africa, or hopefully, and maybe from other places, to give examples of how the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks are also promoting what they call a priori actions, which used to be conditionalities, structural adjustment days, that are pushing austerity and inequalities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And then over to you, Sherilyn, for a concise question.
Hi, thank you so much for this webinar. So I work with the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa, and we are just starting to do research work on how to reframe macroeconomic resources. And so rather than working with a relatively tiny budget and really allowing the space for the austerity narrative to continue, how do we rethink our sources of resourcing and pull in progressive taxes and renegotiate debt? So questions around the quantum of debt, but also the terms and conditions, the cost of the debt, and how do we mobilize progressive forces to renegotiate those terms? Because often the issues are not just the debt to GDP ratio, but the fact that we're not getting enough debt and cheap enough debt, and then around financing and potential measures there. And I guess 2 of the questions are, in terms of tax instruments, your sense or exposure to resource rent taxes as an opportunity to mobilize resources, and then taxing financial assets or financial transactions. Thank you.
Thank you much, Sherilyn. And, you know, a lot of you are giving us a lot of ideas for other things to explore in this series, which I said this is just the beginning session. So I'm now going to ask my speakers a rather impossible task, and that is to answer some of these questions and give your kind of final remarks in 1 to 2 minutes so that we have time for some closing remarks from Diane Nelson and some wrap-ups from me on the Online Events Committee. So let's see, Bhumika, a lot of the questions reference some things that you said, so I'll turn to you first for remarks in 1 to 2 minutes.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So I think, well, Elaine, thanks for highlighting a priori actions. I think that's extremely critical right now. What's happening is I think we're all aware that there's a global South debt crisis, and what's really going on with the global South debt crisis is a really critical lacuna. There's a real void, there's a real absence of any kind of governance mechanism for debt restructuring. The G20's common framework has it hasn't worked on any level. And what's happening is the most indebted countries have to go to the IMF as a precondition for even beginning the debt restructuring process, which the IMF facilitates with creditors and often on behalf of creditors, as we're seeing in the Sri Lanka case. So I'll just point to the example of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt in 2022. It's been under very protracted, very politicized negotiations around it with its creditors. And a key part of the a priori actions for a country like Sri Lanka is that they have to implement certain austerity measures, especially regressive taxation, as a precondition to even receiving the loan, which is a political signifier that allows the restructuring to take place. One of the key things with a priori actions in particular is that it usually highlights, it usually focuses on regressive taxation and this emphasis on achieving what they call a primary fiscal surplus. And this is really concerning. I was monitoring a lot of the IMF loans after the global financial crisis, and most of the loan conditions focused on aligned with the Maastricht Treaty criteria, a 3% fiscal deficit target, meaning that the fiscal deficit of the nation must be 3% of its GDP. Now that has intensified to
sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up as quickly as you can.
Of course. So this transition from deficit to surplus should raise our ears. It's extremely concerning. It really means an intensifying of public spending retrenchment, an intensifying of regressive taxation, an intensifying of squeezing the public and the public sector, where the fallout is on women. So I just want to really highlight that while they may have rhetoric around social protection, social transfers, social safety nets, this is also happening at the forefront, which sometimes cancels out a lot of the other sort of sprinkles of policy space or leeway. So I think the focus does need to be on the a priori action, which just intensifies this fiscal surplus through regressive taxation.
Thank you so much, Bhumika. Odile, I'll turn over to you for some quick responses and closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Media and GE, for organizing this, and also for Diane Nelson for hosting this webinar. I won't answer any of the specific questions, but I just want to reiterate that there are often very arbitrary targets put on global South countries. And I think in terms of macroeconomic policies and actions taken by countries, I do think we need to also remember to take into consideration the ties between financial countries, in terms of the trade agreements, which we have spoken about, but also in terms of the relationship between global South countries, developing countries, if you want to call them that, and the international financial institutions, which sort of perpetuates this dependence of a lot of global South countries on global North countries, right? Whether it be trade agreements, currencies, what have you. But I also want to add, if we're thinking about these arbitrary things, which, if you have numbers, you can add them whichever way you want. But the narratives comment is really important, right? Around what is the narrative around the possibility of a particular country to meet its state obligations, or the particular government, to make sure that the country is economically stable or whatever. So it's important for us to just take into consideration that very global perspective and the relationships between the global North and the global South, which often tends to reproduce the sort of dependence and the tailspin that a lot of global South countries are in, rather. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I think some really powerful reflections on the narrative piece. Diane Parents, over to you for a very brief wrap up. Thank you so much.
I would like to change the narrative similarly to Odile to talk about social as well as economic sustainability, meaning well-being, to talk about public expenditure as investment, to challenge inequality. At one point, world leaders were challenging inequality, but to get that on the agenda and to introduce a wealth tax, incorporating gender-responsive budgeting into all expenditure. Thank you. And thanks for the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those really concise but really important closing remarks. Diane Elson, I'm going to turn it over to you for some closing remarks before I say some things on behalf of the online events.
Well, it was a great panel, great discussions. I think we've got ideas for future sessions to go into more detail on, say, debt sustainability, on wealth taxes, on monetary policy. But a key takeaway for me from this session has been this issue of how do we change the narrative? How do we get out of this straitjacket that there is no alternative? You don't want the debt to be unsustainable, do you? We have no alternative. And what feminist economics can do to challenge that straitjacket of there is no alternative. And I think we can do that at several levels. And we can do it in terms of research of different kinds, qualitative research, quantitative research. We can do it in terms of technical model building models based on different kinds of assumptions, which come out with different conclusions. We can challenge the notion that debt can be made sustainable. Actually, these sustainability calculations are really just ways of trying to justify another IMF loan. And if you look back at the record, none of these austerity programs actually succeeded in making the debt sustainable. So there's a myth about the possibility of achieving debt sustainability, which we should challenge. We should challenge the false economies. We've heard about what happens when you cut investment in the health service, when you reduce the quality of the way that public services are delivered, the impact on women's time, the impact on people's health. These are false economies, which in the end reduce the productivity of the economy. And so we should pull them out as false economies. And we should also, I think, work with, I can see my video has gone crazy again, let's turn it off. We should also work not just in academia, doing research, doing teaching. We should also work with NGOs of various kinds, with trade unions. We should think about how do we demystify macroeconomic policy for other women's organizations, because it tends to be the kind of economics that's least easy for people to get their heads around. In the UK, we work, Diane and I, with a group called the UK Women's Budget Group, which does all of that kind of work. I've put the website, I think, in the chat. And it would be great to have examples of these kinds of initiatives in different countries where feminist economists are reaching out to other organizations and to policy people who have influence on policy to try and change these narratives. It would be great if we could report back in 2 years' time some of the ways we have been able to challenge and start to make inroads into these narratives.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm so sorry I had to cut your responses to questions short as we were running out of time. But this is just the beginning, as we're saying. There's so much to build off of from this event. We're really excited to kick off this series, as I think there is a really important role in, as Diane said, demystifying these aspects of macroeconomic policy that are so critical in our current economic context. So as I continue to plan this series, I'm going to drop my email in the chat. Please reach out to me with ideas, if you want to be involved. Really want to make this as interesting and helpful to you all as possible. As Jihi said, we're also going to be sharing out resources that have been shared in the chat with the recording. We invite you to kind of, use those to pull together things. I think, Fiona, you were asking a question if there would be a kind of brief, but no, we welcome others to do that. I also just want to flag some upcoming events for you all in our online event series. Our next Feminist Economics 101 is going to feature IAFE President-elect Lee Badgett on SOGI issues within the field of economics. That is going to be February 21st. That's a Tuesday from 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern. And then our next fireside chat is going to be co-sponsored with the Rutgers Center for Women in Work. That's going to feature Marianne Hill, interviewed by Gianna Rogers, on building a solidarity society. That's going to be on Tuesday, February 28th from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. So we send out emails about all of our events. You will be on the list for that going forward. But again, a huge thank you to our moderator and our panelists today. I think this was an amazing way to kick off our macroeconomic series. The planet, as all of them have said, so many seeds for future sessions. So please stay engaged with us. Again, feel free to reach out to me with ideas and if you want to be involved in these going forward. So thank you so much, everyone.